Daf Yomi, tractate Bava Metzia, page 87b, where it's still in the Mishnah. A laborer who works with produce attached to the ground. It's saying these are the laborers who may not eat. It's the bottom of 87a. A laborer who works with produce that is attached to the ground, not at the time of the completion of the work. 87b now. Not at the time of the completion of the work. In other words, while it is still growing. And a laborer who works with produce detached from the ground after the completion of the work, when it is sufficiently processed, and therefore subject to tithes. And the laborer who works with an item whose growth is not from the ground, from the land. Gemara, the Talmud says, from where are these matters that a laborer may eat from the produce attached to the ground derived? The Gemara answers, as it is written, when you come into your neighbor's vineyard, then you may eat grapes until you have enough at your own pleasure, but you shall not put any in your vessel. Deuteronomy 23:25. The Gemara asks, we find a source for a vineyard. From where do we derive that a laborer may likewise eat from any other type of produce? The Gemara answers, we derive it from a comparison to the case of a vineyard. Just as a vineyard is unique in that it is an entity whose growth is from the ground, and the laborer eats it at the time of the completion of its work. In other words, when he is harvesting the grapes, so too, with regard to any entity whose growth is from the ground, and it is at the time of the completion of its work, a laborer may eat from it. The Gemara challenges this derivation. What is notable about a vineyard? It is notable in that the owner of a vineyard is obligated in the mitzvah of olelot, the obligation to leave incomplete clusters of grapes for the poor. See Leviticus 19:10. Accordingly, one should not be able to derive the halacha of other types of produce from the halacha of a vineyard. The Gemara explains, we derive the halacha of a laborer may eat from other crops, from the halacha that he may eat standing grain. The Gemara asks, and from where do we derive that he may eat standing grain itself? The Gemara answers, as it is written, when you come into your neighbor's standing grain, then you may pluck ears with your hand, but you shall not move a sickle onto your neighbor's standing grain. Deuteronomy 23:26. Deuteronomy 23. Where were we? Neighbor standing grain. Okay. The Gemara responds, what is notable about standing grain? It is notable in that the owner of dough prepared from grain is obligated in the mitzvah of challah. The Gemara asks an incidental question, and from where do you know that this standing grain mentioned in the verse is the same standing grain whose owner is obligated in the mitzvah of challah? Perhaps the merciful one is discussing any standing produce, not only the 5 grains from which challah must be separated. The Gemara answers, as it is written, when you come into your neighbor's standing grain, then you may pluck ears with your hand, but you shall not move a sickle onto your neighbor's standing grain. Deuteronomy 23:26. The Gemara responds, what is notable about standing grain? It is notable in that the owner of dough prepared from grain is obligated in the mitzvah of challah. The Gemara asks an incidental question. And from where do you know that this standing grain mentioned in the verse is the same standing grain whose owner is obligated in the mitzvah of challah? Perhaps the merciful one is discussing any standing produce, not only the 5 grains from which challah must be separated. The Gemara answers, the matter is derived by means of a verbal analogy between the term standing, written here, and the term standing, written elsewhere. It is written here when you come into your neighbor's standing grain, Deuteronomy 23:26, and it is written there with regard to harvesting the barley for the Omer offering. 7 weeks shall you count for yourself, from the time the sickle is first put to the standing grain. Deuteronomy 16:9. Just as there in the verse referring to the harvesting of the Omer, it is the owner of standing grain who is obligated in the midst of challah, as barley is one of the 5 grains. So too here, with regard to labor, it is discussing standing grain whose owner is obligated in the mitzvah of challah. The Gemara resumes this discussion by reiterating its earlier question. The comparison between standing grain and other produce can be refuted as follows. What is notable about standing grain is notable in that the owner of dough prepared from grain is obligated in the mitzvah of challah. The Gemara answers, let the case of a vineyard prove that this comparison is valid, as the mitzvah of challah does not apply to the produce of a vineyard, and yet a laborer may eat from it. The Gemara asks, what is notable about a vineyard? It is notable in that its owner is obligated in the midst of olalot. The Gemara responds, let the case of standing grain prove that this is not a decisive factor, as its owner is not obligated in the midst of olalot, and even so a laborer may eat from it. Since no exact comparison can be drawn to either a vineyard or standing grain alone, the Gemara suggests a combined solution. The inference has reverted to its starting point. The aspect of this case, a vineyard, is not like the aspect of that case. Standing grain. Their common denominator is that each one goes from the earth, and at the time of the completion of its work, the laborer may eat from it. So too, with regard to any type of produce that grows from the earth, at the time of the completion of its work, a laborer may eat from it. The Gemara asks, what is unique about their common denominator? It is unique in that they have an aspect relating to the altar. In other words, the products of both a vineyard and standing grain differ from other types of produce in that they are both offered on the altar. Wine is brought for libations, and flour and meal offerings. The Gemara suggests tangentially an olive should also be derived to this category of those products which a laborer may eat, as it too has an aspect of relating to the altar in the oil of meal offerings. The Gemara refutes this suggestion. And is the halacha of an olive derived from the common factor of the 2 types of produce mentioned earlier? But it itself is called the fruit of a vineyard, as it is written, and he burned up both the piles of produce and the standing grain, and also the olive yards, Kerem Zion. Judges 15:5. And Rav Papa said, this verse does not mean that an olive is considered the product of a vineyard, as in the verse, it is called olive yard, and it is not called a plain vineyard. Therefore, the halacha of olives must be derived by analogy from the common denominator. I think we'll stop there and pick it up with part 2 of 87b. Part 2. This has been part 1.